following discussion makes numerous references to historical and fictional suicide, which is a recurring theme in Konwicki's work. If you find this content upsetting, please feel free to skip this month's episode. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is a hotline for individuals in crisis or for those looking to help someone else. If you are in the United States and want to speak to them, call or text 988 to speak with a certified listener. Hello, and welcome to Encounters with Polish Literature, brought to you by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. I'm David Goldfarb, and I'll be your host. This is the second of two episodes where we're focusing on writers responsible for challenging the communist system in Poland in the 1960s and 70s. Writers who were part of the system themselves immediately after the war until the death of Stalin in 1953, who knew the system from the inside out and became its strongest critics. Last month, we discussed satirist and playwright Sławomir Mrożek, and today we're looking at the writing of Tadeusz Konwicki. Our guest this month has a lot to say, as was the case last month, so I'll keep the introduction short. But before I introduce her, I'd like to remind you to subscribe if you like our series, click the bell to receive notifications about new episodes, and follow our playlist down in the description below to catch up on past episodes. Katarzyna Zechenter is an associate professor at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at University College London. She has published articles on contemporary Polish and Polish Jewish fiction with emphasis on memory and post-memory, as well as a monograph called The Fiction of Tadeusz Konwicki, Coming to Terms with Post-War Polish History and Politics. She has also published a volume of poetry, In the Shadow of the Tree, published in Kraków in 2012, and is preparing a second volume. Her poems have appeared in journals in Poland, France, and the USA, and some have been translated into English and Spanish. Katarzyna, great to have you back on the program.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for talking about Konwicki.
It's great to have you here to talk about Konwicki. So let's just start out. Who was Tadeusz Konwicki?
Well, he was, and he's still a very interesting character. He was definitely, I know we should not exaggerate, but he was definitely the major, probably the most important fiction writer in communist Poland. And he was also a very successful film director, author of 6 or 7 films, depending how you count it. So Konwicki loomed large over Polish literature, partially because he was also, the last Polish romantic writer.
In what sense was he a romantic?
Polish literature, to a very, very high degree, the one what we identify as truly Polish, essential for Polishness, was written in the borderlands at the beginning of 19th century, in the period we called Romanticism. Yeah, so people like Mickiewicz, Słowacki, they're all coming from the borderlands, the lands that Poland lost in 1945, and it became part of Soviet Union. So Tadeusz Konwicki comes from those regions. He was born in 1926, but because of family problems, he was basically raised by his great aunt and grandfather, who were born in 1863 during the January uprising. So he actually did grow up in the atmosphere of the uprising, because both his great aunt and grand uncle grew up in that atmosphere. And Konwicki, Maria Janion writes often that the sort of popular version of Romanticism stayed with those regions of Poland much, much longer than it was the rest of Poland, central Poland. Mm-hmm. So Konwicki came up from regions which it used to be Grand Duchy of Lithuania. It was a place which was peppered with a lot of beautiful forests, which have a special sacred meaning to the people in those regions. And that's how Konwicki saw that. And then in 1939, when he's a 13-year-old kid, the war starts. So first, those regions are under Soviet occupation. And then since 1941, German occupation, Konwicki tries unsuccessfully get into a home army guerrilla unit, but he's too young. Eventually, in 1944, he's accepted and he fights there. And he Maria Janion calls him the last writer from the Romantic generation, and he talks about this all the time because he's basically repeating, we were the last generation who believes in the ideals. We believed in literature. We believed that literature gave us the model of behavior. And the model of behavior was fidelity to the idea. And the idea was basically freedom, not freedom for just us, but freedom as such. So Konwicki sees himself as a person who he grew up there. In many ways, he admits that, technologically, the place was sort of backward. And he was born near Vilnius, which is today in Lithuania, but then it was part of Poland. With Vilnius before the war had around 67% population was Polish, around 6% was Jewish, 3% Russian, and the other groups constituted the rest. But in general, this Polish Jewish city was Konwicki's universe. And in 1945, after being a few months in the unit and fighting, he eventually escapes. He's extraordinarily lucky. He's in the second last unit in these regions that escapes to what became communist Poland. He's not arrested, but he writes always exclusively about that city. He said that in an interview with Elżbieta Sawicka. Here I shall explain to my admirers that all my books are stuffed full of Vilno, that I go round and round forever writing about Vilno, that actually I have been writing one and the same book all my life. Now, the question would be, what's so special about Vilnius? And for him, today we would use the word Vilnius, then it was Vilno. So the question would be, what is it? So one thing is nature and the forest. So he talks about the forest as having spirit. So if we use Mircea Eliade's terminology, that would be the center of the world, the sacred, the connection to the past. So he talks about the forests as having the spirit of the people. This is always unspecified. I mean, it would be misleading representation to say that Konwicki was a Christian in this respect. But what matters is that nature of that region is sacred. And the center of the world, he talks about, the center of the world was going through those regions. And even in his novels written in the 60s, when he cannot write about Vilnius, this is still censorship, he describes other places in such a way that a careful reader will figure out, that sounds very much like Vilnius. It doesn't sound like...
That's what I was going to ask you. When he's writing about the forest around the Soa River in Dream Book, yes. I mean, is that really the forest around Vilno, or is that, or does he know that forest around the Soa River?
No, he doesn't know the forest around Soa River, although he did travel. But he writes about Vilnius, and Jan Waltz discovered that, because, all the rivers don't go the right way as it was Central Poland. They go as if described. So the valley, the hills, the river, the holy water, the purifying powers of river in Vilnius, it comes back constantly in each of his novels, especially in the political novels of 1970s. So for instance, in his novel that he published Underground in 1977, The Polish Complex, in the line, I mean, this is Poland of the second half of 70s, so everybody's in line for everything. He meets his cousin, Kaziuk, who stayed after the war in what was Soviet Union, and he works at the pig's farm. So one of the first questions the character, the protagonist of The Polish Complex asks his cousin is, so how our forest, how is Rudnicka forest? And the answer is, there's no forest now. We are now all Europe. So for him, the modern world is the destruction. And this idea, the missing forests are constantly missing and reminded in every novel, but it will be half a sentence, And when you think about the role of woods, forest, primeval forest, I mean, Mickiewicz, in the most iconic of all Polish poems, called it home trees, domowe drzewa. The trees are not just trees. They belong to the home, because very often in the borderlands, what the Poles called kresy, so in these regions of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the forests were the homes, because the homes were constantly destroyed. One uprising after another, the Russian came, invaded, the families were shattered. So there are domowe drzewa, the home trees. The region is your home. So for Konwicki, nature is not just the issue that, there are no woods. The woods means destruction of home, complete destruction of home.
There's also like a sense, though, I mean, of a certain period where there's a developing idea of a Polish nationalism is referring to all of Poland, right? And there's also this local patriotism that certainly exists in Mickiewicz's time, and maybe for Konwicki and Miłosz too, they have a certain, like, it seems, local patriotism for this region of Lithuania, I think.
Well, definitely, but in order to understand what it really means, we would have to unpack the word patriotism. Who is a Pole? Yeah, right. For Mickiewicz, for Konwicki, for Miłosz, Pole does not mean ethnic Pole.
Right.
So it is not nationalist in this respect. It is not saying we, the Poles, which exclude other groups. So then let me quote. I prepare a quote which answers exactly your question. What is Poland? Yeah, because when we say Poland today, we often mean ethnic Pole. Yeah, ethnic Poland, for the people going further to the right, it will be the ethnic Pole who is also the Catholic, basically. But this is not what Poland was ever. It's only since 1945 that every Pole is an ethnic Pole and every Pole is supposed to be a Catholic. That's Nazi idea. That's what Herbert said. Konwicki claims that Poland was, I quote, melted from 3 different clays and then fired in the temperature of those 3 elements. The clays were Polish, Lithuanian, and the Belarusian. And the elements were Polishness, Russianness, and Judaism, or more precisely, Jewishness. So in Konwicki's novel, women, for instance, who, and women have to be beautiful in Konwicki's world. They are beautiful because they are a mix of different bloods. So they are Polish, they have some Polish and Jewish blood and Karaim's blood and Belarusian. And he says, oh, my Polish is awful, but actually it's beautiful because it has a melody of Belarusian and melody of Russian, and it has some Yiddish elements. So being Polish from those regions means being a mixed, and the mix is acceptable. So it is not ethnic Polish. Konwicki is the furthest away from saying Polish equals ethnic Polish. Yeah. So this is.
There is an interesting passage, if we can, look at it for a moment, where he talks about what it means to be a Polish writer, which I thought was fascinating. I'm sure you know the passage. In this edition, it's on the Writers from the Other Europe edition. Of course, I have all these old editions of Konwicki right here, because I don't know if Konwicki is really in print. Maybe the Polish Complex is still in print in some sense, or new copies are still owned by bookstores. But it's I think mostly when we're looking for Konwicki now, we're mostly looking for used books or library copies, because they're this is the eternal problem with literature and translation. So I've always, like, whenever I see books, Polish books that I might possibly have to write about or teach one day in English, then I make sure that I buy them whenever I see them, because you never know when you'll need something. So this is he says in the Polish Complex, one day, one moment, I read the first review which termed me a Polish writer, steeped in Polishness, confined to a Polish niche.
Yeah.
I broke into hearty laughter at this obvious misunderstanding. I was, on principle, indifferent to the emotional, moral, or intellectual conditioning of the people from the devastated cities of the Vistula River. I came from a cosmopolitan Eden, from a sunken Atlantis, from an Ur people, an Ur language, an Ur religion. I stopped laughing later. My Polishness was being mentioned by all the critics. That Polishness had begun to turn against this ill-fated author. Because of that unwanted Polishness, I became incomprehensible, monotonous, irritating. I began struggling against it in myself. I grew ashamed and afraid of it, although I never had made any use of it, alluded to it, or even touched on it in thought. To me, it was the most sin-laden of taboos. Of course, I had used certain true details and depicted nature as I remembered it, vague varieties of trees, herbs, and moss, which also grew in Belgium or Canada. I noted incidents from the war, which could have occurred in Italy or Norway. I found psychological or moral deviations, which could have described Germans or Americans as easily as Poles. How did it happen that I am an author of Polish books, good or bad, but Polish? Why did I accept the role which I had renounced forever? Who turned me, a European, no, a citizen of the world, an Esperantist, a cosmopolitan, an agent of universalism, who turned me, as in some wicked fairy tale, into a stubborn, ignorant, furious Pole?
Yeah, this is Hall of Konwicki. And one of the reasons, I mean, this is a superb quote, because this is one of the reasons that Konwicki was misunderstood and began to be misunderstood in the international space is when he became heavily translated during the last years of communism, after he published The Polish Complex in 1977, and then Minor Apocalypse. And after New York Times quoted some grotesque passages from a Minor Apocalypse as a realistic depiction of what was happening in the last years of communism. So, for instance, in A Minor Apocalypse, there's a scene when there's a spontaneous manifestation and people are screaming in Polish and in Russian. They're screaming Poland, Polsha, Poland, Polsha, yeah? So what he wants to show is the Sovietization of the society, but it was seen as an actual depiction, yeah? And then he has a scene in which soldiers are marching through the bridge. But they're marching properly, so the bridge collapses, yeah? No soldiers, even the worst stupid country on earth, would do that, yeah? Every leader of a unit would know you cannot march through the bridge because the bridge would collapse, yeah? So many of those images, which were parodies, they were taken in the West as a depiction that communism is collapsing, especially the image of the Warsaw Palace of Culture that is sort of crumbling down, and he calls it the big toilet in the middle of the crossing of Europe. So he got sort of put in a box which is called a Polish poet, a Polish writer, suffering, persecuted. But Konwicki's idea always was, you want the freedom, but not the freedom. I mean, you cannot exclude other people. And he says exactly the same thing as Herbert said that. So Herbert wrote that, and Konwicki would sign under this with both hands. Herbert wrote, because for me, Poland without Jews, without Ukrainians, without Armenians stops being Poland. This ideal of one nation state is the fascist idea. But this is the Poland that was created in 1945. Konwicki never left the Poland from before 1939. He never left the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, of which he was citizen, and which was acceptance of differences. And the Poles, Ukrainian, Jews, they were all part of it. So him putting him as a Polish poet, a Polish writer, at the same time, it has other danger. The moment Poland officially regained independence in 1989, Konwicki was irrelevant. Yeah, because he was writing about, we want some freedom. And well, we do have a freedom, that's it. But Konwicki is much more than that, because his writing is basically one long search for meaning, for the sacred in the world.
We should back up a bit and say what the Polish Complex is about, right? I mean that this is a work that describes people standing in line on Christmas Eve, and they want to buy Christmas presents at a jewelry store. And maybe they want them for Christmas presents, but one of them is going to go abroad. So maybe he just wants to buy gold if it becomes available so that he can, trade it when he leaves the country for a higher price than he paid in Poland at the time because the market was regulated. And it's interspersed with these historic scenes. So we have scenes of kind of drab, stereotypical communism, standing in line for things, people getting drunk. There's a moment, surreal, and there are many surreal moments, many absurd moments in the work. It's it was one of the first things that attracted me to Polish literature, in general, back in the 80s. Where he, has, sex with the shop girl, the shop clerk, and he has a heart attack. It's all kinds of strange things that are happening at the same time. And then it's interspersed with these historic scenes of heroic moments from the uprisings of 1830 and the January uprising of 1863. Apropos of what you said about the New York Times, I was just reading an obituary of Konwicki. He died in 2015. Is that correct? Yeah. In the New Yorker. That's about the Polish complex. And I guess I must not have read that particular obit at that time because it describes the plot of the Polish complex as being about people standing in line at a liquor store.
And it says
it twice.
Complete misunderstanding of the book because, okay.
But it's totally a Polish stereotype, right? I mean, it's like imposing.
Exactly, and that's the tragedy. And that's the exactly tragedy. That's the reduction of Konwicki to something that he is not. First of all, okay, the people are standing in line. Fine. That seems, okay, not a complicated metaphor to understand, Under the second half of 70s shortages, communism means shortages, everybody stands in line. But Konwicki places those people in line to a jewelry store. And that's a choice. You can or you don't have to stand in line. And also he places them on the most important of all Polish holidays, Vigilia, the Christmas Eve. They don't have to stand in line because this is not a line for bread or butter. If they were standing in line for food, nobody could question it. Hunger, you have to stand in line for bread. Here they are standing in line for they know the shop will get Soviet rings, golden rings, which are decoded as symbols of shackles. So what Konwicki suggests, and this is the power of Sovietization, what he's trying to say, it is not that the people are beaten up or hungry enough that they have to subjugate, they do it willingly. And the rings, they are repeating that, I can sell it and make some money. So this is not subjugation. This is more of a sort of people decide that they will let themselves to be subjugated. And you mentioned this thing with drinking in the line, because everybody knows when they are standing in the line, and we are talking about hours and hours of standing in line, not about half an hour, but hours. So
there's a certain element to like the Decameron or something where they all kind of form a community amongst themselves in the line.
But they go to some place where they illegally sell alcohol. Okay, funny, Polish, but that's not the point. The point is that the electricity goes out, but TV with a program How to Learn Polish goes on. So this particular scene, the absurdity of it, if you have no electricity, TV is not working. In communist countries, TV, which can be easily decoded as propaganda, is always on, no matter what you do. But the decision to stand in front of the shop, that's your decision. And this is what Konwicki did in his second very famous novel, A Minor Apocalypse. Sovietization is not presented as something that the Poles are beaten up, forced to accept. It is that they mentally agree with it and they are not putting any fight. So this is what, in this respect, it applies to every society that is being subjugated by any totalitarian system. It's one thing like in 1984, Winston Smith has no choice. The system is too oppressive. Here in Konwicki's world, in Minor Apocalypse and the Polish complex, the Poles still have a choice. And they are allowing themselves to collaborate. They are allowing themselves to stand in line on Christmas Eve instead of not buying the rings and going home and celebrating. So it is this subjugation, spiritual subjugation, that's for Konwicki is Sovietization. It's not the fact that you are beaten into submission, but rather that you allow yourself to be subjugated because you say, well, I cannot do anything, therefore I will collaborate with the system. And Konwicki does have a little bit of history with it because he was one of the leading socialist realist writers in the early 50s.
Right.
And he just like Szymborska or Kołakowski, they never 100% explained it. Yeah, they sort of avoided saying why. And when you look at Konwicki, he also is not trying to explain it, but there's one thing to say that he actually honestly believed in the system after the war. So he escapes to what becomes the communist Poland in 1945, because on the border now there's a Soviet Union. Yeah. And he is not a party member, but in 1951, Tadeusz Borowski, one of the author of most tragic and fascinating stories about what it means to be, how to live in a concentration camp, he commits suicide.
Right.
He commits suicide a few days after his daughter is being born. He just cannot deal with the system. Borowski simply cannot deal with the system that he served.
We're planning an episode on Borowski with Irena Grudzinska-Grosz.
And at the funeral, Konwicki stands up and says, I am going to replace the dead. I will join the party in place of Tadeusz Borowski. So he honestly seems to believe it, but then he does something else. He's married. His wife is pregnant. What does Konwicki do? He goes to Kraków for a few months and digs soil like thousands of workers to help building the ideal new socialist city, Nowa Huta. That clearly suggests that he believed the system, yeah? I mean, he abandoned his wife, not abandoned, but obviously communication, he couldn't see her quite often. The communication at the time, we are talking about 1949, is not exactly very good, yeah? The transport to Warsaw, that's one full day. So he cannot see her, and she is pregnant. But he works for 6 months, works and stays it's like a barracks where, the rooms have for 10 people, just each of them gets a bed. But he works as a digger, simple digger, in Nowa Huta to build Nowa Huta, and he writes really lousy novels supporting socialist realism. Yeah. And very quickly, for the first novel at the construction site, he gets state prize. Okay, fine.
This was Przybudowie?
Przybudowie, that's right.
Under construction, right? I've never read it, but you have, because
you didn't lose much.
Because you work on Konwicki more than I do. So
I did. I mean, I wrote a book about him, and so I read everything he did. But my point is that he honestly must have believed that to leave his pregnant wife to go and work there, yeah? And then since 60s, because 1956, they are first sort of, Stalin dies in 1953, 1956, Poland sort of is going back to a more relaxed system. So Poland 1945 to 1953, that's a very different Poland than 1956 and afterwards. And Konwicki is officially the member of the Communist Party since 1951, since the funeral of Tadeusz Borowski. But in the 60s, he started writing protest letters. I mean, he writes a protest letter, an expulsion of Kołakowski. He is beginning to be annoyed with the system, but he officially doesn't leave the party. And he is so sort of also angry with himself that he believed in it, that in 1956, when his novel Marshes, Roysty in Polish, appears, he basically stops writing and he takes a camera, makes a film on his own. Just 5 people with 2 actors, he makes a film and sends it to different festivals abroad, and it gets Grand Prix in Mannheim, in Venice, and in Brussels, yeah? So he's so disappointed.
Which film was the first one?
The Last Day of Summer, Ostatni Dzień Lata. And it was seen as a creation of a new genre because he wrote the script, he filmed, he's basically 100% person behind the film. Normally, films are made by the directors. There's a script. There are different sort of people work on a collaborative project. Konwicki creates the film, which is basically one-person film the auteur, so basically the author's film. He has 100% say. And the film gets prizes partially because it's sort of it seems at the first glance that this is not the polished stuff. It's about two people, older woman, younger man, who meet at the beach. There are planes flying overhead, sort of. The danger of war is always there because the plane seems to be menacing, and the couple sort of is together, is not, and then the boy disappears, probably drowned. But basically, it's two people trying to figure out what's the meaning of life after the war, after the Holocaust. And this constantly comes back to Konwicki, the search for meaning after what happened during the war. Because for Konwicki, the war is sort of going back, the war and the Holocaust is going back to sort of, he calls it at the beginning of a minor apocalypse. So the novel begins with him being tired and, waking up, and he doesn't feel like it. And then he says, I have to get up. I have to rise from my bed and perform 15 acts whose meaning is not to be pondered. An accretion of automatic habits, the blessed cancer of tradition, meaningless routines. But the last war not only took the lives of scores of millions of people without intending to, accidentally, the last war also shattered the great palace of culture of European morality, aesthetics, and customs. And humankind drove back to gloomy caverns and icy caves in their Rolls-Royces, Mercedeses, and Moskviches. Moskvich is, of course, the Soviet car. Right. Yeah. So this whole idea that everything that at the beginning there was war, World War II, is the end of the world, and there's no return to the sacred. And I want to go back to what I said earlier, that, this region, the borderlands and Vilnius, for him, that's the sacred. Yeah. So then the modern world is the profane. Mm-hmm. And I'm going by Mircea Eliade's a dichotomy, sacred versus profane. And then the center of the world is the palace, the center of this profane world, this immoral modern world is palace of culture. That's the axis mundi. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's because Konwicki got the flat with a view. I mean, when he got the flat as a writer of books that were applauded by the system, he was awarded the flat. Yeah, and the flat happened to have view on Palace of Culture. So Palace of Culture is one of the sort of most stable elements in all of his novels. There's a mentioning of him seeing the Palace of Culture, and many of his novels take place within you can see the Palace of Culture. It's either in the basement, or there's something, or there's in the novel Ascension from 1976, the whole half-drunk people go to the top of the palace and they are trapped at the top of the world, at the top of this profane world, yeah? And all they want is to come back, or go back. There's no going back, yeah? So Warsaw and this profane modern world, this all started with World War II. Yeah, because as he said, this is a destruction of aesthetics, destruction of morality and custom. Yeah, so the Holocaust and the extermination of the Jews for Konwicki, and he talks about this. He talks about this in almost every of his autobiographical books. Yeah, he says, "A planet." This particular quote is from 1982, Moonrise Moonset. What about the forgotten world? About the world, the universe of Polish Jewry? The planet has died. A globe was burned by a cosmic catastrophe, a black hole, antimatter. God, how did it happen? Anti-Semitism, philo-Semitism, Zionism, nationalists, converts and Hasidic Jews, hatred and rivalry, moments of solidarity and community, good days, bad days, humanity, bestiality, everything mixed. World on one, this world on this one earth, divorced and connected, two civilization and two cultures, two mentalities and two characters. And suddenly, during the short night of occupation, something was amputated. Yes, this world, great like a thought, deep as love, beautiful as longing, has changed into dust. It torments me. It will always torment me. So this is 1982. But if you look at, for instance, how he described his characters, he mentioned, because this is something that basically after 1956 and then especially after 1968 is not really mentioned in Polish literature. So that's Polish Jews, yeah? So Konwicki often decodes or says, oh, I am a Jew because I don't have my home. I feel like a Jew because nobody wants me. So his characters often depict themselves, understand themselves as Jewish. Jewish meaning we are persecuted, we are not wanted. So this comes back to Konwicki's growing up in a Polish Jewish city with different minorities together. So the cities are very Polish in this respect, yeah. But this, despite some different acts, the connection, all those groups collaborate and they work together, yeah. And this is you see that in what, I don't know, Herbert writes and Czapska, and of course Miłosz, who grew up in those regions, yeah. So this idea that those groups can live together peacefully, that doesn't mean extremely loving each other, yeah. But this is still a country before the end of the world, which is World War II, yeah. And for Konwicki, so this is one tragedy, is the war, and then you have another totalitarian system that he did support. He did support, he got benefits. We might not think as this is a great benefit, but one of the benefits, let me read you where he traveled in the 50s when getting a passport was basically an impossibility, yeah? But Konwicki at that time, so now he goes to Helsinki in 55. In 1956, so 1 year later, he goes and travels through China. This is all sponsored by the Polish Union of Writers. He goes to Venice. He goes to Frankfurt in 1962. Then he goes, then in 67, the late 60s. And he still travels. He goes to, in 1972, who goes to America. So he travels, he's able to travel. Yeah, those are the clear benefits of the system. Although since 1960s, he writes protest letters, he's not with the party still sees him as a very valid tool because he's extremely well-known writer. Yeah. And
he's exportable.
He's very exportable. He gets prizes, but then he writes the Polish Complex, which is written. He cannot publish it officially. That would be impossible. So he publishes this in one of the first issues of Zapis, the first underground monthly. Yeah,
published in London, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then 2 years later, he publishes in 1979, he publishes A Minor Apocalypse, which is also published by Zapis. But what needs to be stressed here, the underground publications in Poland, they appear in huge numbers since 1976. So 1976, the technique of printing is not exactly very good. The papers are shoddy, they fall apart. But later on, they are published in the West and brought to Poland, yeah? So the main émigré centers like Paris and London are sending those books to Poland, the same from Germany, yeah? So Konwicki is a well-known writer. Officially, he doesn't get so-called, because there are different types of censorship. So he can have a name censorship that would be the worst one, which means nothing with the name Konwicki can appear. The communist system cannot do that. He was too well-known. He's a well-known fiction writer, author of many films. They cannot censor him, yeah? Right. So they can only censor his books. So they censor the Minor Apocalypse and A Minor Apocalypse and the Polish Complex. Those two books are not mentioned. But Konwicki is mentioned, and after 1976 in underground press. And we are not talking about few journals. We are talking about literary journals. We are talking about huge numbers. Professor Paczkowski, historian, established that at least every 50% of Poles read that stuff. That's a huge number, yeah? And For instance, Zapis establishes, and Konwicki eventually becomes one of the people on the editorial board, establishes prizes for the writers. Writers clearly, they send under their own names stuff to be published in Paris, in Paryska Kultura, in Parisian Culture Monthly, and then they go back to Poland. Yeah, they are published here in London, and then they. For instance, Odnowa, the publishing house Odnowa here in London, run by Miss Aleksandra Kulczycka and her husband Jerzy Kulczycki, they send those books back to Poland. Yeah, so each time when a Polish scholar ends up in London in the 70s, they bring bags of the publishing houses to Poland. So when I was a student, then I can go, I need a letter from my professor that I need those books, and I can get the illegal publications in the Jagiellonian library. That tells you something about how not horrid the communist system was at that time. Yeah. All I needed was the letter, one sentence letter from my professor that I needed for my studies. That's it. And I get all the illegal stuff. Kultura is at that time already in Jagiellonian Library, which is the main university library in Krakow. In other words, when Konwicki publishes this stuff in 77, 79, it is as good as if he published in the official press, because everybody discusses it, yeah? And also there are quite a few journals which discuss quite a few literary journals of the time which discuss this as literary books, yeah? Now, after that, the West gets the books that are translated. I mean, this A Minor Apocalypse gets translated by Richard Lurie. I mean, those are superb translation. And then, after martial law is declared, Konwicki and Miłosz are the two most quoted Polish writers, Polish fiction writers, yeah? Especially what sort of helps the West to imagine the crumbling communist system. Crumbling was essential. And Konwicki is very good at showing everything crumbles, yeah? Especially the Palace of Culture, because it's a very simple metaphor. You have Palace of Culture was opened in 1955. They started to build it, I think, 3 years earlier, so in 1952, I think, I'm not 100% certain. And it was built by 3,000 Soviet workers and 2,000 Polish workers. And it was called the Palace of Culture and Science of Joseph Stalin. It was a gift to the gift of the Soviet nation to the Polish nation, yeah. But obviously, in 1956, it's not seen like this. Stalin finally, I mean, everybody is happy that the period of socialist realism is gone. Yeah, there's a new wave of writers who are freely writing what they are thinking. That censorship sort of shrinks, does not disappear. And Konwicki, when he publishes the stuff in the 70s, in 77, everybody knows him. The West is translating and quoting him all the time, constantly the same passages about the crumbling Palace of Culture. And Konwicki travels. He travels to Chicago. He goes he's constantly being invited. And then, in 1980, Miłosz got Nobel Prize. That also helps to promote Polish literature, because Miłosz talks in his Nobel Speech Prize, he talks about the oppression and communist totalitarian systems. And for instance, Konwicki got international prizes for his novels. So in 1981, he gets a Italian Literary Prize for A Minor Apocalypse. Then then martial law is declared. Yeah, and Konwicki is not extremely successful novel, Underground Rivers, but it's also published in underground publication, yeah? And then he travels even more. He gets more prizes in Australia. And basically he teaches, he's even invited to teach in Paris in I don't remember exactly, but in the 80s. So his fame as one of the leading Polish writers is very well established. And then he writes the novel, which is probably easiest to understand in many ways, which is Bohin Manor. The novel, which talks about the love between a Polish noblewoman and a Jew, yeah. And the novel, this particular novel, is it's so popular and sells so well that the Economist chooses the Economist, Bohin Manor, precisely. So the Economist chooses Bohin Manor as the novel of the month. Only 2 books, Polish books, until 1990 were ever appeared in The Economist. And one of them was Kapuściński, and the other was Bohin Manor. Yeah, and one of the reasons that the novel was so popular is because it talks about love. It includes, and it sort of does not really delve into totalitarian versus non-totalitarian systems. There's no politics, not much history. And of course, there's a very passionate love, which is...
and there's a lot of the landscape. There's
a lot of landscape, but it's also... Okay, if you wanted to look at the concept of love and what happens to a woman, to Konwicki, well, all the words like, patriarchy, misogyny, all is there. Yeah. Definitely. But there's also multiculturalism and coexistence, and there's something else that needs to be pointed out. Okay, Konwicki's father was born out of wedlock. Mm-hmm. So Konwicki did not know who his grandfather was. Yeah, he died very young. He died when Konwicki was only 3 years old. Right. So he grew up more or less as an orphan. Yeah, but in Bohin Manor, he writes about, and we have here that many critics assume that what Konwicki writes is a family story because he says, I, Tadeusz Konwicki, this is about my grandma Helena. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is always like Konwicki's, his narrative pose, right? His narrator is always called, Tadeusz Konwicki. He's
no, not Tadeusz.
Well, not all. Or Tadek, he shares autobiographical, characteristics, and he's a writer often, and but he's still a character, right? I mean, it's still the character of Tadek Konwicki, which is not. Is that Tadeusz Konwicki? I mean, it's always going to be a construction.
But that's the whole point, because, Gombrowicz does that. Lejeune calls it biographical pact, that we assume that the author, the narrator, and the protagonist are one. And Konwicki plays with it, but he also leaves a lot of hints that, no, this is not exactly me. So, for instance, in A Minor Apocalypse, obviously the main character, who is not a very successful writer, Tadek Konwa, he has this love affair with granddaughter of Stalin called Nadezhda, and she's a virgin. But the point is, he says, I have 2 sons. Well, everybody who knew anything about Konwicki knew that he had 2 daughters. So he constantly says things which are clear that, no, this is not me, Tadeusz Konwicki. Mm-hmm. But in a Bohin Manor, the story is about, he says, this is about my grandma. And my grandma, so she was engaged to a young man who dies in a January uprising against Russia. Yeah. And then she meets this Jew. And he says, can you teach me Polish? I don't know how to write and read. She knows he's younger. She knows that he's educated. But obviously, he probably speaks Hebrew and Yiddish, but he doesn't know how to write. That's the excuse he gets to get closer to her. And then they have a passionate love affair. And then she gets pregnant. And in the novel, the father of the woman kills him for, the fact that he slept with his daughter. They consummated it without, obviously, they cannot get married because they are of 2 different religions, So Konwicki said that he did it, he imagined, because he could never find out, and he did not find out who actually his great-grandfather could be, So he invented him as a Jew. But when you look at Bohin Manor, many critics assume, we have another Polish-Jewish writer who is of mixed Polish-Jewish blood. Yeah. And in this book is fascinating because now we see that, especially with the second generation of Polish Jewish writers, quite a few comes from mixed families, which means one of the parents is of ethnic Polish, the other is ethnic Jewish. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, Rottenberg, Kuryluk, Zaremba Bielawski, there's maybe 7 or 8 writers whose books appeared in last 10 years who are talking about their mixed parentage. Yeah. So
Agata Truszyńska. Agata Tuszyńska.
Agata Tuszyńska, exactly. Monika
We'll be on the show later, maybe
exactly.
next year.
This is a huge number of writers, but Konwicki sort of foreshadowed that was inventing this Polish-Jewish love story. And in Polish culture, we don't have too many novels talking about Polish-Jewish love. But what I want to stress here, the reason that, because there's a huge class difference between them, she comes, from a manor house, he comes from the village, he's what she doesn't know who he is. But he's sort of presented as he fought in the uprising, and therefore he's equal to her. So what unites them is the patriotic religion. They both fight for Poland. And also he's a character who, okay, fine, misogyny of the highest degree, but that's what she expects, because for Konwicki, beautiful and submissive woman that sort of returned to patriarchal systems, and that's going back to those sort of chivalrous time, the romantic times when the man is supposed to be chivalrous and honorable towards the woman, when the woman is supposed to be submissive. Obviously it doesn't have the same charm for us as it has after Simone de Beauvoir wrote The Second Sex. Right. But for Konwicki, this gorgeous woman who gives herself to this passionate and in some ways a little bit too energetic lover is, for Konwicki, this is the ideal world that also ended in 1939, because this is the patriarchal world, and Konwicki is definitely very much, in this respect, patriarchy, that's what he likes, So his female characters, and you mentioned the fact that the protagonist is often Tadeusz Konwicki or Konwa, decoded as the author, So he has love affairs in each of his novel, and they're spontaneous.
They're like his fantasies or something like that, right?
But you also know that the women are always they're getting younger and younger.
Yes.
So his character almost gets a heart attack in Minor Apocalypse when he has sex with the woman, but she's a virgin. They're always a virgin, So in the Minor Apocalypse, then we learn that the woman, she's the one who is supposed to help him to commit suicide as a act of, he's supposed to self-immolate to protest Poland's being incorporated into Soviet Union,
Right.
Then the woman...
So just so if we could back up. So the story is that there are these, two... Hubert and Ricio are two dissenters, and they know that the protagonist of the novel is they don't know that they're in a novel, of course, but the protagonist of the novel is somebody who's just suicidal, and suicide appears in all of his works. There are suicides everywhere, and there's self-immolation, and of course it's in the wake of the famous two self-immolations of 1968 of Ryszard Siwiec in Warsaw and Jan Palach in Prague. So those are certainly kind of part of the background of the work, and they convince him as an act of protest to immolate himself on the steps of the party headquarters. So that's what the story. That's the story.
But so we will do two quick things. One is Sovietization and how does the Soviet communism works on the Poles. But the second, we will finish what happens between him and the woman. The woman has a slightly ironic name, Nadezhda, which means hope. She's the one who is supposed to help him to self-immolation, so not much of hope. But she says, I am a granddaughter of Lenin and I am a virgin. Well, and she's also married. She was married before, so she cannot be a virgin. But this idea that, a woman is supposed to be a virgin because she's supposed to give what's most precious to her to the man because it's such a passionate love. So it is, a few minutes before they meet, they fall in love. It's instantaneous. It's a truly romantic love. Obviously, today we wouldn't look at it like this. But for Konwicki, this is the fact that she gives herself freely, immediately almost, right there. It is a proof of a truly passionate romantic love, So that's one thing which is in Konwicki probably still difficult to accept the way he portrays women. So women are beautiful, their intelligence is of not much interest to the character, what is important is the sexual act, because for Konwicki's protagonist, the sexual act is basically a search for meaning. And you mentioned this idea of Konwicki's protagonist often sort of being on the verge of suicide because he's constantly searching for meaning. Mm-hmm. And this is, the sexual act, it is always, he often describes it in terms of maybe like going up to the hill so you can see more. Conquering something so you will know what you are conquering. So he's basically looking for something that would add meaning to his life. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this repeats itself in the novels, in his novels of the 60s and 70s and 80s. So the woman is submissive and all for the man. She as such is of no importance, and she has to be young. Old women in Konwicki's are always symbols either of witches or in the unhappiness. I mean, there's nothing worse than being an ugly old woman in Konwicki's novels. Yeah, so they are always decoded as witches. But this is one aspect that definitely we could say that
the scenes of the male gaze are so transparent, and I think today we would find them a little cringy, like when they're waiting in line outside the shop and he's checking out the woman whom he decides to call Ivona. I don't think, and then she says that her name is Basha, and maybe neither.
Because she's irrelevant, She's irrelevant. She as a human being is irrelevant. What matters is the sexual consummation for the male, because he is searching for something. She's just a tool. So in this respect, yes, all those words, patriarchy, misogyny, yes, that's Konwicki. So this is something that definitely didn't stand the test of time, But other Konwicki's idea, fidelity, the idea that you fight for certain values. Mm-hmm. And this is, we started with, I said that he's the last Polish romantic poet, and I just wanted to explain why Sovietization and why Konwicki has a truly important message to say about how totalitarian systems work. Because and in many critics, especially foreign critics, sort of simplified his message to such a point that, Sovietization means power, abuse, and beating up into submission. That's not where Konwicki sees the major danger. Sovietization is basically losing moral values so you can survive. And for him, there is a boundary which you cannot cross. Yeah. So, for instance, in A Minor Apocalypse, to follow what you said, there are quite a few characters who collaborate with the system. They get benefits from the system, but they see themselves as opposing the system. Mm-hmm. And he sort of divides them into two: the positive opposition, negative opposition. Negative opposition are people who oppose the system, they get punished, they are put in prisons, or they disappear. Positive opposition are the people who supported the system, but they say they do not support the system, and they do things so they will be the first one, because if it's done by Polish hands, not by Soviet hands, therefore is a lesser evil. Mm. So they are basically collaborating with the system. And this is a discussion. This is an extremely important discussion that has been discussed in Poland since 1828, last 200 years. And let me... I will try to make it rather clear and sort of simple. So in 1828, Adam Mickiewicz writes Konrad Wallenrod. Right. Konrad Wallenrod is a longer poem about a guy called Konrad, who is a Lithuanian. But the Lithuanian lands are being abused by the Teutonic Knights. Konrad marries, is happy, but, I quote, he didn't find happiness at home because there was no happiness in his homeland. So he decides to fight the Teutonic Knights. To make the story short, he becomes one of the Teutonic Knights, the leader, and begins a war against Lithuania in such a way that the Teutonic Knights have to lose. Mm-hmm. So basically, using lies and deceit, he manages to destroy his greatest enemy. Yeah? If this was the story, it would be very simple. There's a person who fights for freedom of his people, but Mickiewicz basically makes poor Konrad pay a heavy price. He becomes a drunkard because he knows he's dishonest. This is this old chivalrous idea that when you fight face to face. You are not deceitful. Yeah, Konrad Wallenrod pays for being deceitful. First, he becomes alcoholic, then commits suicide. Right. Yeah, two horrible crimes. So this started a huge debate in Polish Polish culture, whether is this a positive or negative character. So, for instance, Słowacki wrote, "Wallenrodity or Wallenrodism, that has done much good, most of all. It introduced treason to the method, and from one traitor made 100 traitors." Yeah. Right. So basically, it is not. You have to fight in an honest manner. You cannot be deceitful. Yeah. So characters in a minor apocalypse, like for instance, Professor Edward Schmidt, who teaches the police how to understand, he lectures the police in the censorship office because he is trying to tell them how to understand metaphors in literature and how to put in
illusions. That's the passage about illusions.
Exactly, yeah.
That's a great
passage. So he says, "You are a fool. Don't you realize we are experiencing the next great flood? An ocean of shit from the east has inundated us from the Bug River to the Elbe. And one must survive this cataclysm, survive physically and save one's soul." So what Konwicki does, he goes back to this discussion. If you are immoral, does the great goal, which is fighting totalitarian system, allows you to behave immorally, unethically? Yeah. So it is not that, that's why Sovietization is terrifying for Konwicki, because it corrupts the people. Yeah. And they become immoral because they think that the idea fighting totalitarian system in the long run is worth the ethical corruption. So there's no answer to this question. Yeah. And then with this, comes the other thing, which is the concept of honor. Yeah, fidelity to an idea. And this is, out of all the romantic ideas, this is the most romantic idea. And when you think about the war generation of which Konwicki is a member, he was born in 1926, this idea of honor, complete fidelity to honor, this justification of it. That's, of course, works of Joseph Conrad, and his Lord Jim. You basically, all the writers of that period, Szczepański, Miłosz, Andrzejewski, they all write about you have to be faithful to an idea, And then the communists obviously couldn't stand that, because in Marxist philosophy, you cannot be faithful to the idea. You are faithful to the current party line. And the party line changes. So Joseph Conrad was one of those, because everybody read Joseph Conrad. And when you look at diaries, I don't know, from Dąbrowska, diaries of people during, especially Szczepański, because he wrote the short story In the Service of the Great Shipbuilder about Conrad.
Yeah, so and he translated a number of Conrad's novels. Yeah.
And he is very clear that you cannot, if you get morally wrong, then there's no point of fighting for an idea because you are already a casualty. Yeah. So that's what Konwicki does in that story in Minor Apocalypse. The people who, first of all, say we are all Konrad Wallenrods, we are opposing the system. And Konwicki says, no. You are basically supporting the system, If you corrupt them yourself in the first place, you are as good as the Soviets. So Sovietization is not the danger like in 1984. The system beats you into submission. If you corrupt yourself, then you cannot defend the greater cause, which is the honor, fidelity to certain ideas and freedom, And
but he seems to always be sort of expressing a certain amount of guilt about himself, sort of also, supporting the system. I mean, that, of course, referring to like the time when he wrote socialist realist novels, but, arguably, he never stops writing socialist realist novels. I mean,
well, he does. He stops after 1954.
Well, here's the question. Formally, is A Minor Apocalypse a kind of production novel about organizing a suicide in one place, one time, one day? It's like, except instead of building a hydroelectric dam or something like that, he's staging a protest. Or if you look at at the Polish complex, standing in line, it's like a parody of a socialist realist novel. I mean, of course, it's not socialist realist because it doesn't express the party line, but there's a certain period when there are a lot of these novels, like One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich is a kind of production novel about a day in prison. You could sort of see them that way. That formally some writers never escape the form of socialist realism, even though they're writing against it. Łasko, right, is always writing parodies of the socialist realist novel.
But it is in many ways you are right, but okay, it's not standing in line. It's standing in line to a jewelry store, which you don't have to do. So this is the element that Konwicki points out, is the fact that it is voluntary. Sovietization, the danger is, as long as you oppose the system, as long as you go to Konrad's Patna, whether Lord Jean would leave the boat earlier or last, it would make no difference to anybody who would die on that boat, yeah?
Right.
It's not that your action will have consequences, but you have to believe in your idea and stick with it, yeah? So Lord Jim didn't, and he couldn't live with it, yeah? And so Konwicki is also trying to say, if you are morally corrupted, like, because both the characters who come to tell the protagonist of A Minor Apocalypse, you have to commit suicide, they are both already corrupted characters. They are still, for instance, one of them wrote the book during the communist times, and he's taking still money from the government, and the book became obligatory reading in primary schools, yeah? But now he feels, I am against the system because I collaborated earlier, yeah? Konwicki, to be 100% honest, Konwicki never explained 100% why he believed in that system. But I have to say that he also was not unique in this, because after the tragedy of September 1939, after what happened and the war, during the war, the anger at the pre-war Poland was huge. It was really huge. I mean, so many writers were angry that Poland in 1939 didn't fight for a few months, that the army wasn't strong enough, yeah? That the Poland went into tantrum and discussion of how great they are instead of doing something. So, and for me, what is shocking is the fact that Konwicki came from Vilnius. He spent all war there, with the exception of last few months. He must have known about mass murders. He must have known about the mass deportations. There's something like 200,000 Poles were shipped to Siberia from those regions. He must have known that and yet he decided, and the fact that he did go, he actually literally worked in Nowa Huta must mean that he believed in that system, yeah? In some respect, you could say this is like Borowski, yeah? Borowski went through hell, went through Auschwitz, understood that this was not an aberration, not bad men killing some people. He understood that this is a global shift, yeah? Because it was, he writes in one of the stories, we are building a new civilization, yeah? And then says, if Germany wins, they will create religion. So if Germans win, they will justify killing of the Jews and the Roma. They will justify it as a religious moral act, yeah? So Borowski also tried for a few years, believed in that system. It didn't work, yeah? He did commit suicide. He gassed himself in 1951. And so maybe Konwicki also, tried and tried. He did leave the party eventually, but after 1954, he really doesn't support the system.
No.
And he writes every protest letters, participates, does everything. And he's one of the leading, figures in the anti-communist movements after 1976, yeah? But Sovietization, and for me that matters, is because to assume that the dangers come from the fact that some oppressive system beats you up into submission, that's a simplification, yeah? Because that's not what the danger is. And I think this is what makes Konwicki a very important writer for the coming times. The oppression has changed. The oppressive system don't work by beating up people. They have better methods, yeah? And one of them is to corrupt them spiritually, ethically. And that's how Konwicki sees Sovietization. This is a quote from his long interview with Nowicki, Half a Century of Purgatory.
Right.
People don't know they are becoming Soviets. I am trying to warn them beforehand. People don't know that they are starting to talk Soviet. How many Russianism they are all over the place. And why their stores always closed? Are people sick? How healthy everyone was before the war. This is Russia already. You don't do anything, you get everything from the state, and then you go out and end up drunk in a ditch. So Sovietization is basically moral corruption, but moral corruption cannot happen until you agree to be morally corrupted. And I think this is one of the sort of something that transgresses Konwicki's novels about communism. Communism may have ended in Europe, but the dangers of moral corruption, this is something that can happen in different places, yeah? And it's still happening, except that, the danger has changed.
Thanks so much for joining me on the program.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Wait up. Please subscribe and click the bell to stay on top of the program. Watch the credits for some recommendations about how you can support aid for Ukraine and for Ukrainians fleeing the war in their country. I'd like to thank all the people who helped to make this series possible. The Polish Cultural Institute New York sponsors our program. Bartek Remisko, head of Humanities and Literature at the Polish Cultural Institute New York, is our executive producer. Natalia Iudin is my fellow producer and editor. Our opening and closing music is by Radek Przedpełski. Thank you all for listening and for reading along with us. Let's meet again in a month when we'll discuss the contemporary poetry scene in Poland and two of its brightest lights, Tomasz Różycki and Krystyna Dąbrowska. See you then.
To szary dzień, jak zawsze w tej okolicy. Cała sceneria dodaje się chwytlanej fotografią zilustrowanej gazety. Tak szare, tak płaskie są domy, ludzie i pojazdy.